Hey everybody out there, it's Timothy here looking at the best of the best for Kaladesh. I am recording this on a Thursday, which means pre-release is tomorrow at midnight, technically Saturday, but you get the point. And I wanted to go ahead and go through the set and give you my opinion on what I consider the best commons and uncommons from each color, including artifacts as well, since it is a big portion of this set. Figured it was worth mentioning those as well. So a couple disclaimers here. First off, this is all completely my opinion, so if you disagree with something, that's perfectly okay. I do like having debates about cards, so leave comments and we can talk about certain cards and why you either disagree with me or why you might think that I've hit the nail on the head with certain color combinations or colors or artifacts or whatever it is. Just let me know below what you're thinking. Second off, this is subject to change. The set is not out yet, and if you watched my Eldritch Moon recap, you can tell that I was really spot on with some colors and missed the mark completely on other colors. Sometimes you look at a card, especially commons and uncommons, and you know for a fact it's going to play out very well. This is usually true for the removal spells in a set. But when it comes to the creatures and it comes to the format-specific cards or format-defining mechanics, it makes it a lot harder to evaluate cards here. And then final thing I'll say before I move into the green cards for this set is that the quality between commons and uncommons is quite different. You'll notice when we talk about a lot of the commons, the power level drops off significantly. There's usually around one, maybe two really strong noticeable commons, and then the rest kind of waver between pretty poor or pretty average and so on and so forth. But when we get to the uncommons, there's quite a few really good uncommons. For instance, in red, it was really hard for me to narrow it down to what I think is the best, because I think vast majority of the red uncommons are super strong. But anyway, I'll mention that when I get to them. We're going to go ahead and kick it off with the green cards. What I consider probably one of the best, not the best maybe, is Hunt the Weak here when it comes to green commons. And the reason I say this is because I've played with Hunt the Weak in different formats before. It was in, I believe, Fate Reforged, maybe Dragons of Tarkir, one of those formats. And also recently in M15, maybe Origins. I believe it was M15 actually. And it's just an altogether good card. It is a 4-mana sorcery, so it is a little clunky, but it works very nicely in this kind of set. There is a little mini theme of +1/+1 counters, which you can kind of say for any set, but in this case, there is a little theme of 1/1 counters, and it works nicely with other green and black synergies in particular. It also is just an efficient fight spell. When your fight spells give you some sort of boost on top, especially when they give you a permanent boost in the form of counters instead of just a temporary boost, they tend to work out very well. Hunt the Weak has definitely made its way into top green commons in other sets, and I don't really see a reason to think that it won't do so here too, so I'm definitely calling it one of the top commons until I see a reason to knock it down from that notch. The other green common I'll mention that really stood out to me as very strong is Pima Outrider. This is 2 and double green for a 3/3 trampler with Fabricate 1, which means you can either have this coming as a 4-mana 4/4 with Trample, which is very good on curve for a common, or you can make it coming as a 3/3 trampler for 4 in addition to a 1/1 servo, and I feel like that option is going to be much more likely. When it comes to Fabricate, you'll probably default to the servo option more than a 1/1 counter about 3/4 of the time. That's just a random guess, of course. I'm not doing any math behind that. It's just what it feels like. But in either case, you're getting a very quality, very good common for your 4-drop slot. So it fits a nice part on the curve. It's a relevant creature type. It has a keyword ability on it, Trample, making it marginally better than it would be otherwise. And it just fits the curve very nicely. A 4-mana 4/4 spread across 2 bodies is great, and on just 1 body with Trample, it comes down a turn earlier than most other comparable creatures. So I think it will stand out in this set as a creature that just fits the curve extremely nicely. The other ones, like I mentioned, there's kind of a big drop-off here when it comes to commons and uncommons. So besides these 2 commons, it was kind of hard to figure out what I consider the strongest cards to put under my honorable mentions. This is essentially 3rd and 4th place for all extents and purposes. But here, Riparian Tiger is 3 and double green for a 4/4 with trample. Enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy counters, and when it attacks, it gets +2/+2 if you pay 2 energy counters. So it attacks as a 6/6 trampler at least once, and then just kind of falls off there. As a 4/4 trampler for 5, you can do better, especially considering that the Pima Outrider is essentially a 4/4 trampler for 4. But if you can constantly generate energy, and it seems like green might have the tools to do that, then this card is very aggressive and comes down, again, a turn earlier than most comparable creatures, at least on the attack. The other one I'll mention here is very similar, and that's Thriving Rhino. This is 3 and a green for a 2/3 Rhino creature. When it enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy counters. When it attacks, you may pay 2 energy counters to put a 1/1 counter on it, part of the Thriving cycle, all of which I think are very playable good cards in their respective colors. What I will say about Thriving Rhino is that it essentially taxes a 3/4 on turn 4, which is great. It's ahead of the curve of pretty much every single other creature you'll see on turn 3 or 4, meaning that it gets some clear attacks in there, and it is the type of card that you're not scared to pump more energy into it. By the time it attacks the second time, if you have the energy to put into it, it's becoming a 4/5 that you only initially invested 3 mana into, and to me that seems like a great deal. So I really like the Thriving cycle. I think this might be the only one I actually put on a top list here, but they're all very comparable as far as how they fit on the curve and how they work. It is worth noting, of course, with any energy producers or anything that consumes energy, that cards that make energy can, of course, be used to benefit other cards besides themselves, and cards that use energy benefit more when you have other cards that create it. So there's a lot of synergy in this set. It's hard to evaluate how cards like Riparian Tiger and Thriving Rhino will really play out until you start drafting the set and start making sealed pools and seeing really how much energy you can actually fit into a deck. Moving on to the uncommons, I think there are some clear top uncommons. The first one here is Servant of the Conduit. Probably my pick for best uncommon in green. It's 1 in a green for a 2/2 Elf Druid. When it enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy counters. You may tap and pay an energy to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. I think this is a fantastic card. Could easily be a rare in my opinion. It's very reminiscent of cards like Deathcap Cultivator and Sylvan Caryatid, obviously a different twist on it, and there is a limitation to how many times you can ramp with it or how many times you can fix your mana with it, but the fact that it comes in and gives you 2 energy counters right off the bat, and you can use those to at least ramp ahead twice or at least fix your colors twice, seems extremely good for an uncommon to me. Normally you get these kind of like 2 mana, 2/1s or 0/1s or 0 whatevers that tap for green mana. In this case, Servant of the Conduit is kind of filling the same role, but is much better in that it taps for any color, ramping you ahead and also fixing your colors. And I will point out there is not a lot of mana fixing in this set at all. So if you're the type of person like me who loves to jam a 3rd color into a deck that doesn't really need it, this is the way to go here. So I think this card is fantastic. The other one I'm not really arguing here, I think is probably second best, is Nature's Way, and that's just because it's comparable to cards that are almost always the best in green. For 1 in a green, you get a sorcery that gives target creature you control vigilance and trample until end of turn, and it deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So this is essentially the same exact thing as Rabid Bite, but your creature also gains vigilance and trample, making it a little bit more relevant in combat. It is a sorcery, which always hurts your fight type effects, but keep in mind this is not a 2-sided fight. It is just your creature dealing the damage. So your creature will very, very likely survive, take something out, and be a little pumped up with the keywords in order for it to rumble in combat that turn. These cards are usually great. They have been in the most recent sets where they've been kind of leaning towards one-sided fight more than regular fight, but I have no doubt in my mind that this card will play well. I could be surprised, of course. Maybe this is not a 1-for-1 format, but I think Nature's Way will definitely prove to be a good card here. Other honorable mentions for uncommon green cards include the Arborback Stomper, which I actually had in place of Servant of the Conduit until I really analyzed Servant of the Conduit. Arborback Stomper is 3 and double green for a 5/4 trampler. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 5 life. So the body is pretty big. Trample is relevant on a 5-power creature. It gains you a significant portion of life, so if you're up against aggressive decks or burn-heavy decks, this guy can definitely get you back in the game and stabilize, kind of as a mini Thragtusk, which is what I've seen a lot of people compare it to. Obviously no Thragtusk, but you get the point there. And then with there are a surplus of, or I should say there is a surplus of blink effects in this format compared to other ones, or effects that bounce creatures back to your hands, like the 2/2 Dwarf or Aether Tradewind or something like that, and being able to replay this and gain more life seems really good. So this is the type of card that it has a high enough incidental life gain on top of an already decent body with a relevant keyword, enough to make me believe that it's going to play out very strongly, and I would not mind playing multiples of this card because of its ability to stabilize the game for you. Armorcraft Judge came in as very close 4th pick here. There are a lot of good green uncommons, but I think Armorcraft Judge definitely proves to be good. For 3 and a green, you get a 3/3 Elf Artificer. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. If you ever draw even one card off of this, it seems fantastic. 3/3 for 4 that draws you a card is great in pretty much any format, and I have no doubt it would be good here. With Fabricate floating around, like I said, you'll probably fabricate for servo tokens more often than you will for the 1/1 counters, but if I can follow up a Fabricate creature with Armorcraft Judge, I might just pick the 1/1 counter because that card is going to end up being better than the servo token I would have gotten. In most cases, I think, not all the time. Not to mention there are just enough cards, with already having seen one in Hunt the Week, that just put 1/1 counters on your own creatures, that I think the judge will come down and draw you a card at least half the time if you've drafted with this card in mind. So I think it's really good. I think it deserves a top spot here. Of course, it'll take a little bit of play to realize if that was the right pick or not, but I think it's got the potential to be one of the top dogs here, or top rhinos or elves or whatever it is. Moving right along to our red cards. The first card I'm going to mention is Welding Sparks. This is 3 in a red for an instant that deals X damage to target creature. X is 3 plus the number of artifacts you control. I'm willing to bet throughout the course of a game it's not too hard to get at least 2 artifacts to stick on board, whether those are something like puzzle knots or vehicles or what have you, maybe just some artifact creatures floating around. So Welding Sparks at a base of 3 is already decent. 3 mana, instant, deal 3 is already a fine card, but the fact that it scales a little bit and has the potential to deal more damage is just fantastic, especially for a common. It doesn't hit players, which is always just a minor strike against burn spells, but it deals enough to creatures that I think you'll play almost every time in your red decks. The other card I'll mention here, and this is kind of iffy, again, the commons are pretty tight as far as power level goes, but I think Reckless Fireweaver has the ability to be completely abused in this format. For 1 in a red, you get a 1/3 Human Artificer that says whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. We're not even going to mention how good this is in Two-Headed Giant, but I will mention that if you can just drop about 2 or 3 artifacts throughout the course of the game, this has definitely justified itself as a 2-drop, dealing 3 damage while providing a decent blocker. Maybe some weird stats for a red deck, but this guy just sits back and does an impression of Thermo Alchemist or Nettle Drone or whatever you want to call it, pinging your opponent every now and then for cards that you're probably already playing in your deck. Red and black especially have a heavy artifact theme where their cards get better depending on how many artifacts you are able to play. This guy is definitely one of those, and while I could see him being knocked down from one of these top 2 slots, I'm willing to bet as of right now that the build arounds you can make with this card are really, really strong. Other cards I will go through and mention here include Chandra's Pyrohelix, which is essentially Twin Bolt, or as I like to call it, Chandra with Flames art number 17. I think we'll see another one here in a second. Twin Bolt, it definitely impressed me in Dragons of Tarkir and even in Conspiracy, which is a format where cards like this you wouldn't expect to be very good. But I think the Pyrohelix will do a good job here, being able to pick off servo tokens and Thopter tokens very easily, while also just occasionally being 2 damage to the face. It is flexible enough that I think it's quite strong, but it is weak enough that I don't think it needs to be the top common or anything like that. I'm usually happy to have as many of these effects in my deck as I can, though, and it does make for a good sideboard card if you can't fit it in the main. The other one is Spontaneous Artist, and I kind of picked this just for the sake of having another creature rather than all removal spells on this list. Spontaneous Artist is 3 and a red for a 3/3 human rogue. When it enters the battlefield, you get an energy counter, and you may also pay an energy counter to give target creature haste until end of turn. I think this is really interesting, especially in red-green builds, which seems to be probably one of the stronger builds for limited in this format, because there are a lot of haste creatures. There are a lot of extremely aggressive, pushed, very brutal attackers in this format. And just being able to use your energy to make a 3/3 haste is already decent enough. Obviously, this card's not blowing me out of the water, but the fact that there's some flexibility in letting you use other sources of energy to give other creatures haste is really good. What I really like about this card is that you can give creatures haste without paying mana, and usually that's the downfall to cards like this, is that you have to pay some stupid amount of mana to give creatures haste, or you have to do it in the form of an aura or something that's not really appealing. Here, if you're able to generate energy, then you can essentially threaten to have hasty creatures at any point as long as the artist is on the battlefield. So I like it as an attacker on its own, and I like the flexibility that its effect provides you. The uncommons were really difficult for me to pull out when it comes to the honorable mentions, but I think Harnessed Lightning is a shoo-in for one of the best uncommons here, and I don't think anyone's arguing about that. For 1 and a red, you get an instant that allows you to choose a target creature, you get 3 energy counters, and then you choose any amount of energy. Harnessed Lightning deals that much damage to that creature. So one interesting thing about cards like this is that you do not actually choose how much energy to pay until your opponent lets the card resolve. So if your opponent wants to respond with a pump spell, they have to do it before they know how much energy you are going to pay. So you could easily target a 2/2 with this effect, intending to pay 2 energy counters and deal 2 damage to it, but if your opponent's trying to save them with a pump spell, they have to run it out there ahead of time, meaning that you can scale down on how much energy you pay. If you know that your opponent's pumping their creature, then you can just choose to pay 0 and end up with 3 energy counters. Obviously, that's not what you want to do with this card, and most of the time you'll use it as creature removal, but the fact that this is just on its base a 2 mana deal 3 to target creature at instant speed, whereas we just saw a weaker version of this essentially in the Sparks card. I forget what its name is already. It's literally to the left there, but I don't feel like clicking. And then it scales in power with the more energy you have, leads me to believe that this is just a slam dunk uncommon. I have no doubt about it, probably one of the strongest uncommons in this set, definitely for red. Brazen Scourge, perhaps very close in power level to some of the other red uncommons, is just, on its base, it looks like a very impressive creature. It is a little difficult to cast with the double red, which can be annoying in some games, because this is the type of card that's extremely good on curve, but drops off a little bit after that. So if you can reliably play this on turn 3, it gets in there for a lot of damage. It is just going to run over anything else that your opponent's played by turn 3, assuming there's no Death Touch creature floating around, and it's just going to smack in for damage while also applying more pressure on every turn after that. If this were 4 mana, it would be that much worse. It would basically be akin to Spontaneous Artist. But Brazen Scourge is really strong, in my opinion, if you get it on turn 3. It is the type of card I would hate to see in multiples because it applies so much pressure so early in the game. 3 mana 3/3s are already fantastic and limited. Making it a 3 mana 3/3 with haste is just that much more deadly, and I would hate to see my opponents dropping this in an aggressive deck. Honorable mention number 1 goes to Incendiary Sabotage, and I'm crossing my fingers on this one because this is kind of the card I like to play, or at least it's the type of card I enjoy playing, but it's not necessarily the type of card that always pans out well. For 2 and double red, you sacrifice an artifact as an additional cost, and at instant speed you deal 3 damage to each creature, including your own. So this can backfire, and obviously you would leave it out of a deck where everything you own and control dies to it. But the fact that this is just an uncommon version of a board wipe for almost everything in this format is quite good. This is going to kill nearly everything, and keep in mind those Fabricate cards, your opponent's often going to be spreading those out in the form of tokens rather than making their creatures beefier, meaning that the Incendiary Sabotage will often sweep up an entire board rather than leaving some big fatties on board. It doesn't play very well against green, which has a lot of high toughness creatures in this format. Same kind of goes for white, but it can mop up the floor in a way that most other uncommons and commons can't do, being able to potentially offer you like a 3 or 4 for 1, or well, I guess 4 for 2 since you're sacking an artifact. The other kind of tick against this is that you do have to sacrifice an artifact in order to even cast it, which means that there are some times where this is just going to be sitting in your hand, but most decks will have a healthy number of artifacts, and I don't think it'll be a problem too often. The other uncommon slot could have gone to a number of different cards, but I ended up giving it to Furious Reprisal. This is Chandra with Fire Art number 72. For 3 in a red, you get an uncommon sorcery that deals 2 damage to up to each of 2 target creatures and or players. So you get to potentially wipe out 2 creatures, which I guess is living the dream, but isn't really asking too much. For 4 mana, killing 2 creatures is fantastic. Obviously, sorcery speed makes it just marginally worse, but not that much. If I'm going to be killing 2 creatures reliably with this, I'm fine casting it at sorcery speed. And then the fact that you can kill a creature and also dome your opponent for 2 seems like a nice option too. 4 mana killing a creature, still pretty good, even though you're probably trading down on this card, so you want to engineer it in a way that it's going to be killing multiple creatures. I want to say also that this last slot, or at least these last 2 slots for the honorable mentions, could have gone to at least 3 or 4 other cards, but it just barely sated my bias here for me to pick the removal spells over the creatures, because the creatures will take a little bit of testing for me to really determine how good they are, whereas removal spells are tried and true, and they're usually pretty safe bets when it comes to your first couple drafts and sealed events. Right along, we're at the black cards, the commons here. First one I'll mention is Die Young, very similar to Harness Lightning in the way that it works. For 1 in a black, you choose a creature, get 2 energy, pay any amount of energy, and that creature gets -1/-1 for each energy you paid with this card. Same kind of deal as Harnessed Lightning. You do not pay any energy until the card resolves, which means that if your opponent wants to pump a creature to save them from your Die Young, they have to do it before you choose how much energy to pay, meaning that after that happens, you can just say, alright, well, I'm not going to pay any energy and let it store up. With that being said, this card scales the same exact way. It's essentially a sorcery speed version of Harnessed Lightning, but slightly weaker, and obviously it is a common instead of an uncommon, but it plays the same way. In most games, this will work as a 2 mana, -2/-2, which is already a great card even at sorcery speed, but the fact that this scales into the late game and has the potential to kill even bigger things off of your 2 mana card seems quite good. Black is not the best position to make use of energy, but it does have a good number of cards that work well with it, including Live Fast, which is ironically paired with this card as far as flavor goes. So keep that in mind, that this card does scale in power, and that's why I think it's quite good as one of the best black commons. Tidy Conclusion is again, a tried and true type of design for an instant speed card. For 3 in double black, you destroy a creature and gain a life for each artifact you control. The life gain here is just like an added bonus. Sometimes you might gain 2 to 3 life, and that's quite good off of an instant speed kill spell this expensive, but it is just something that you're actively looking for in limited, and that is unconditional removal. This kills anything that's not hexproof or indestructible, and there isn't a lot of that floating around, or at least not a lot of good indestructible floating around. I'm looking at you, monkey cat creature. But Tidy Conclusion will work out most of the time you want. As 5 mana, you can't afford to have 4 or 5 of these in your deck, but at 2 or 3, it'll play very well. And it's a card that, if I were drafting this set, I would take it as a sign that black is quite open if I start seeing these late in the pack. Honorable mention number 1 goes to Lawless Broker, which is basically just a solid 3-drop curve filler. For 3 in a black, you get a 3/2 Aetherborn Rogue. When it dies, you put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. As I mentioned earlier with green, there's a minor 1/1 counter theme when it comes to black and green, and this guy feels that quite nicely. He also just works quite well as a 3-mana creature, able to get in damage if your opponent has a slow start, able to trade off if your opponent's on par with you, and able to give you some sort of benefit for trading off, which is what you want out of your 3-mana creatures. Very similar in design to Byway Courier, probably a little bit worse, but I don't know, I might be saying that because of the art. But Byway Courier was an impressive card in Shadows over Innistrad, and I think this is the same kind of deal. You're happy trading it off, and you're happy if it doesn't get blocked, and you're just dealing 3 damage. But the benefit when it dies makes it what I believe be one of the best black commons here. The other one goes to Subtle Strike, and with this card it is worth mentioning that black actually has some decent combat tricks, the type of combat tricks that'll often leave your creature alive while killing an opponent's creature. Subtle Strike is all of the best modes of Borrowed Malevolence, which was a card that panned out to be very, very good as a common in Eldritch Moon. Subtle Strike here for 1 and a black is an instant that allows you to give a creature -1/-1 and or put a 1/1 counter on target creature. So oftentimes you can use this to maneuver a combat in your favor, potentially getting a 2-for-1. If you ever kill a creature with the -1/-1, maybe something aside from a Servo or Thopter token, then this card goes from good to great, and that +1/+1 counter is a big deal. Not just for the color considerations like green and black's theme, but also just because it is a pump that stays around, making this card have a little bit of added value throughout the course of the game rather than a one-shot effect. Uncommons here include Essence Extraction, which I believe will be very good in Limited and probably an extremely high pick, one of those cards that you're looking to actively take if your rare is quite bad. For 1 and double black, you get an instant that deals 3 damage to target creature and gains you 3 life. 3 damage is enough to kill almost everything in the early game, including a lot of late game creatures. Instant speed makes it quite good against weaker vehicles and just otherwise decent cards. And the 3 life is relevant too if you're playing some sort of mirror match against an aggressive deck, or if you're playing just a control deck in general that wants removal spells. It is worth noting that you will gain the 3 life even if you don't kill something, and sometimes you have to run this out to do that. But honestly, this is a removal spell, and it's a pretty premium one at that too. Not quite as good as a murder, but pretty close behind that as far as power level goes. The other black uncommon that I like here is Aetherborn Marauder. 3 and a black for a 2/2 flying lifelink creature. When it enters the battlefield, you may move 1/1 counters from any number of other permanents you control to Aetherborn Marauder. The perk here is if you ever move even 1 counter, this becomes a fantastic creature. 2/2 flying lifelink is already okay, but that's a common level quality card. I would play a 2/2 flyer with lifelink for 4 mana in a lot of decks, but when it has the potential to be 3/3 or higher, then we're really talking. As I mentioned, this is one of the cards that wants you to have 1/1 counters floating around in your deck. Black has a lot of Fabricate creatures that can do that, and green has a lot of creatures and spells that give 1/1 counters anyway, so Aetherborn Marauder will probably be at its best in a black-green shell, but even then, even in just a mono black or a heavy black deck, this is a fantastic card. Move a counter, you've got a real threat on your hands. Move multiple counters, you've got an absolute bomb on your hands. And at uncommon too, this seems quite strong. Honorable mention number 1, speaking of Fabricate creatures, there's Weaponcraft Enthusiast, or Robo Assassin's Creed as I like to call them. 3 and a black for a 0/1 with Fabricate 2. Very simple design, but it presents quite a bit. 3 bodies with total 2/3 toughness, power toughness spread across 3 bodies is fantastic. Obviously, you could play a 3 mana 2/3 as is, but spreading that power and toughness out seems quite good. This works very well with the counter theme if you just need to fabricate and get counters on a creature, and it works very well with the blink theme in white where you can make some tokens, blink this out, make some more tokens, or do what you will with the card. I think it's flexible enough and such a low mana investment that it very much justifies having one of these spots. And the other card is Underhanded Designs. This is probably more of a build around than it is an inherently strong card. But what it does is for 1 and a black, you get an enchantment that drains a life from an opponent whenever you play an artifact by paying 1 mana. And for 1 and a black, you can sacrifice it to destroy a creature, but only if you control 2 or more artifacts. So it's not too hard, again, even in black, to get some artifacts going. As you can see by Weaponcraft Enthusiast, that gets 2 artifacts on the battlefield by itself. But Underhanded Designs kind of highlights what black wants to be doing, and that is putting a lot of artifacts into play. Black has a very aggressive artifact theme, probably even more aggressive than red, where a lot of cards care about you owning artifacts or controlling them, and a lot of cards care about artifacts entering the battlefield. Underhanded Designs gives you the potential to drain past a lot of blockers and give you a way to still close out a game and keep your life total high, even if your creatures are no longer able to get in there. So I like it. It trades in for a creature at some point in the game, and it just does enough for a 2-mana enchantment that I think it will be played. I think it'll be played out very strong here. It is a build around though, so there is a chance that maybe it's poor in your deck. Obviously, if your draft goes poorly and you don't get enough playable artifacts, it becomes a lot worse. And it's not the type of card where you start playing bad artifacts just to enable it, but it's the type of card I would pick early and hope that it works out and pans out quite well in my deck. Halfway there, we're looking at the blue cards now. Gear Seeker Serpent is what I consider probably one of the best blue commons here. And the reason I say that is because blue is already fitted to play a control game, but blue has very recently been shafted when it comes to game finishers. Most blue finishers at this cost and this power level often have some sort of downside, but Gear Seeker Serpent has nothing but upside. It looks like a 7-mana 5/6, but because of the affinity for artifact ability on it, it'll often come down as a 4 to 6 mana, I think, throughout the course of a game, and that's being kind of not even optimistic. Like, that's just how it'll play out. You'll have artifacts in all of your decks. I wouldn't ever expect this to come down for just double blue, but if you can, then good on to you. For 5 and a blue, you can also make it unblockable, and that means that it can close out a game if you're playing a very controlling game. Maybe you've locked up the board and you just need a way to finish the game off. Gear Seeker Serpent can do that for you. So I like the card. I think that it might look a little inconspicuously bad, but it's actually going to play out quite well. Time will tell here, of course. The other card I'll mention is Aether Theorist, or Aether Starfish. 1 and a blue for a 1/3 Vidalcan Rogue. When it enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy. You may tap it and pay an energy to scry 1. So over the course of the game, if you have no other real energy sources, this is a 1/3 that scries 3. And that's very reminiscent of a lot of very good cards. Perhaps I shouldn't say scry 3, but scries 1 3 times. There is a difference. That makes it very close to Omen Speaker from Theros, which was enter the battlefield scry 2 with the same stats and cost. It makes it close to very memorable cards like Sigiled Starfish and Geist of the Archives, which are probably a little bit better because they don't have a cost associated with their scry. But here, the cost is mitigated a lot by the fact that you just get 3 energy counters anyway, not to mention that blue has quite a few ways at common and uncommon to generate a lot of energy. Scrying throughout the course of a game is quite good when it comes to limited, and I would not pass on this card, not to mention that it's a decent blocker in the early game as well. I think this card is a lot stronger than it looks. Maybe I'm crazy about that, but I think it's going to play out very well. After that, the blue quality commons kind of dips a lot. Malfunction is only on this list because it's a card that is it's just a solid card. It's never a card that's so good that you're looking to actively pick it, but it's a card that if you're blue, you will pick it and probably end up playing it. For 3 and a blue, you enchant an artifact or creature. You tap that creature when it becomes enchanted, and it does not untap during its controller's untap step. So pretty much the exact same thing as Sleep Paralysis, except it can enchant an artifact in addition to just enchanting creatures. I can't think of very many artifacts I would want to lock down, but if your opponent has an artifact that taps for some sort of repetitive ability, this can tap that down as well. But this is essentially blue's version of creature removal. Very clunky at 4 mana and a little bit easy to deal with when it comes to blink effects and bounce spells in the format, but you will play it most of the time, at least a couple of them, and it can help you win a tempo game or an aggressive blue-based game just by having this sort of effect to deal with things. The other card I'll mention is Weldfast Wingsmith, and honestly, I don't think this guy is like anything crazy, but it was really hard to pick another blue common to put on this list. It was either this or something like Windrake or the 1-mana bounce spell, and none of those are particularly exciting either. What this guy is he's a 3 and a blue for a 3/3 human artificer, and an artifact entering the battlefield causes him to gain flying until end of turn. So he's a hill giant that flies maybe every 3 turns or something like that, which seems like an okay card, but nothing to write home about. So I think he's fine, but I think he's also a replaceable dude. The uncommons here are very strong, just like every other color. The first one I'll mention is Shrewd Negotiation, and I think this is actually a very powerful card. For 4 and a blue, you have a sorcery that tells you to exchange control of target artifact you control and target artifact or creature you don't control. So play a puzzle knot, get some sort of bonus, swap it with your opponent's best creature. Very good here. Obviously, it's probably going to play out a little less perfect than you would want a good number of times, but you can just play servos or fabricate creatures and swap a servo token with your opponent's best card. Like, it just does so much for an uncommon. Mind control effects are already pretty good. Switcheroo effects are a little worse than straight up mind control effects, but when you're able to draft this card and know that you have it, you can hold it until you have something that's not really powerful to give to your opponent and then take something powerful for them. Not quite a 2-for-1 in most situations, but it will play out at least as strong as the average 2-for-1. At least I think so. I think this card is quite good. Long-Finned Skywhale is also a very aggressive blue creature in a format where, blue is probably not the most aggressive color. Long-Finned Skywhale is 2 and double blue for a 4/3, wait for it, whale with flying and can block only creatures with flying. I do warn against drafting very heavily creatures that can't block, so that is a huge downside and probably one of the worst downsides a creature can have, but you want to be attacking with this anyway. It does get in the air for a lot of damage. It is unfortunate that it has 3 toughness and every red spell seems to deal 3 damage, and the blocking is a downside, but if you ever stick this and get a couple turns in, it just dominates the air for a couple turns. It is very powerful. It is basically super Vaporkin, and a lot of games of Magic have been won by Vaporkin, so keep that in mind. I think this card is powerful enough to be one of the top uncommons. It could easily be bumped down to honorable mention with the power level of the blue uncommons, but I think I'm going to keep it up here for now until I really see it play out. Era of Innovation is another card I'd like to give a shout out here because I think it does quite a bit. It is a little bit of a build around as well. You can tell that just by looking at the text, but it requires you to do a little bit of extra work, but the payoff is definitely there. For 1 in a blue, you get an enchantment that says, whenever an artifact or artificer creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay a mana. If you do, you get 2 energy. For 6 energy, you can sacrifice Era of Innovation and draw 3 cards. So throughout the course of the game, this turns into a pretty cheap draw 3, which is nice, but where I'm more interested in it is if you're generating that energy for other purposes. Obviously, for 2 mana and 3 artifacts or creatures enter the battlefield and 3 more total mana, you're just playing a 5 mana draw 3 that comes down and sits there for a while. But if you can use this to generate energy for other cards that need it, I think it's quite good. And as you see, like, blue has a little bit of an energy theme going on, and while I'm not really talking about rares in this video, there are a lot of rares that are mana hungry, or I'm sorry, energy hungry, and this might be the card you need to work with those and unlock the full potential of those cards. Next after that is Glimmer of Genius. This is 3 and a blue for an uncommon instant. Scry 2, draw 2, get 2 energy. This is everything I want in a draw spell. It's essentially a better version of Read the Bones, but for 1 more mana, being instant speed, not losing any life, and gaining energy is all upside from Read the Bones, which was already a very playable common card. The Scry 2 before the Draw 2 is amazing if you've ever played a card like this, and the energy is basically just bonus here. I would play this as a draw spell just as is. 4 mana instant speed Draw 2 is usually borderline playable but gets cut a lot, but scrying before the draw makes it that much more powerful. Improving your card quality with the scry and guaranteeing, or at least making it much more likely that you draw something relevant, seems very good. And again, the energy is a bonus here, but it's not really something I'm figuring into the power level of this card. A couple other uncommons could have made it on this list here, of course, but I think Era of Innovation and Glimmer of Genius were cards that deserved a shout out here, and something that I would be looking at very highly in my pre-release sealed pools. Final color before talking about the artifacts is white. First card, obviously, on this list is Revoke Privileges. For 3 and a white, you get an enchantment aura. The enchanted creature cannot attack or block or crew vehicles. A 3-mana pacifism is still a 3-mana pacifism, and just like Choke and Restraints or any other pacifism effect we've seen, this card is going to play out very well. I pretty much guarantee that. And then the extra bonus of making your opponent unable to crew vehicles with that creature seems quite good as well. The only downside to cards like this is that if you slap it on a creature that has an activated ability, it still gets to do that activated ability, but that shouldn't be too much to dissuade you from taking this sort of card early and often. Glint Sleeve Artisan, very likely one of the best commons in this set. It's just very flexible and very strong for a common. For 2 and a white, you get a 2/2 with Fabricate 1. So you either get 3 power and toughness across 2 bodies, or you get a big 3/3, which is not something you see at common very often with no downside. Usually there are 3/3s for 3 throughout a set, but they're uncommons and they have downside, or they're commons and they have downside. This is all upside, and the fact that you have the flexibility to spread it out if you want it makes it much better. This is the type of card I can see having a 1/1 counter a little more often than the Servo token, depending on what kind of deck you have, but it plays out extremely well, and I think it's just very pushed power level for a common card. Impeccable Timing, the Johnny art that everybody wanted here, is 1 and a white for an instant that deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. I can't quite give this one of the top spots because there are times where this sort of effect is not what you're looking for. Maybe the creature you want to kill is not attacking, or it's not blocking, and you just want to get it off the board some other way, but you can't force it into attacking or blocking. And also sometimes your opponent's bomb creature is just big enough that 3 damage won't take it out. What this is still good at doing is locking up creatures in the early game, destroying very early threats, probably around turn 2 to 5 before some bigger things come out, and is just a solid piece of removal for the early games of Magic that drops off a little bit later in the game. It's very similar to Gideon's Reproach from Battle for Zendikar, which was the same effect but 4 damage instead of 3, and that card was fantastic, so I have no doubt that this card will play out quite well too. It is just a little bit it is worth mentioning that the card does drop off later in the game. And Propeller Pioneer is not really that far off from Glint Sleeve Artisan in power level. It's 3 and a white, so 4 mana total for a 2/1 Human Artificer with Flying and Fabricate 1. So essentially a 3 power flyer for 4 mana, which is something that we've seen before in Cloud Mana and Aberrant Researcher and so on and so forth. Those are usually playable cards, 3/2 flyers for 4. And then again, the flexibility in spreading this out is quite good. These are the cards that make me feel like Chandra's Pyrohelix deserves a top red slot, though, because if you spread the damage out, you're giving your opponent an opportunity to kill 2 creatures. Although now that I think about it, that doesn't really matter, because if you put a 1/1 counter on this, then they can just aim both damage at the Propeller. So ignore that. I did not say that out loud. At any rate, 3 power flyer for 4 mana is decent, and even a 2 power flyer with a 1/1 attached is still a pretty good card. Uncommons, I have no doubt that Sky Whale Shot will take the top uncommon spot. For white, for 2 and a white, you get an instant that destroys target creature with power 3 or greater, and then you scry 1. So not only is this reprisal for 1 more mana, but it's reprisal for for more creatures with a scry attached. It's really funny how you can attach scry 1 to like any card that already exists, and then it looks even that much better. And this just kills pretty much anything you want it to. You want your 3 mana spell to be killing bigger things, not smaller things like your opponent's 1-drop and 2-drop. So this does exactly what you want it to, and then the scry is a bonus on top. Not much to say about the card other than that, because it's very obviously a powerful card. I don't think anyone's arguing about it. It's definitely first pickable quality when it comes to uncommons. And then Aerial Responder, also first pickable, and now that I look at them side by side, maybe this is a toss-up. Like, if I had both of these in a pack and a bad rare, which one would I take? That's a very good question. But Aerial Responder, aka Vampire Whitehawk or Dwarf Pyre, never mind, whatever, is 1 and double white for a flying, vigilance, lifelink, 2/3 dwarf soldier. So relevant creature type with relevant keywords, a decent body for its mana cost, and the only real downside here is that the double white means you may not be able to cast it on turn 3, but the lifelink on this and the flying on it is what makes it really good, with vigilance just being an added little bonus to make your opponent's life miserable sometimes. The card is obviously pushed as far as power level goes. It's really good, and it's nice to know that there is a dwarf lord in this set that pumps your dwarf. So aerial responder, very clear sign that white is open, and you'll take it early, you'll take it often, and sometimes this is better than your rare. Actually, a good number of times this will probably be better than your rare card. Honorable mentions go to Fairgrounds Warden, 2 and a white for a dwarf soldier that enters the battlefield and exiles a creature your opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. So a new twist on Banisher Priest and Banishing Light and Quarantine Field, maybe not as strong as Quarantine Field, but you get the point. These creatures that come down and exile something until they leave the battlefield. We've seen it a bunch. It usually plays out very well. I have no doubt that it'll play off well here, but the only thing I'll say is that these cards tend to be overrated. They do give your opponent the opportunity to get their card back, but they also work as lightning rods, meaning your opponent might have to use a premium removal spell on your 3-mana creature, which is not really where they want to be a lot of times, just to incentivize them to get their creature back. So keep it in mind. The body here is decent, the effect is decent, but it's not so powerful that I would take this over something like Skywalker Shot or Aerial Responder. And the other uncommon here is a Visionary Augmenter, 2 and double white for a Dwarf Artificer with Fabricate 2. If you just put 1/1 counters on this, it becomes an average card, a very common, bland 4/3 for 4. But if you spread the damage out, you're getting a lot more bang for your buck, allowing your mass pump spells and token-related spells to become that much better. I like the flexibility here again, even though you'll use the tokens way more often than you'll ever use the counters. The fact that you get to choose based on the board state makes this card quite good, and I would be hard-pressed to find an uncommon that's quite stronger than this in white. So unfortunately, there are already some uncommons that are clearly stronger, but Visionary Augmenter still deserves one of these spots here. And finally, you get to hear me almost finish droning on here. The commons and uncommons for colorless cards. And this is a very difficult thing to go through because colorless cards fit in every single deck. So obviously you won't be seeing puzzle knots here because they only fit in certain decks. I'm looking for the cards that are ubiquitous, the cards that you can fit in pretty much any deck, and they'll play out quite well. And you will see a lot of vehicles on this list, just letting you know. The first one is Sky Skiff. I think this card has the power level to be really good. It's not quite as strong as a 2-power flyer for 2, because the crew 1 means you have to have something else getting going. But it does let you translate some damage on the ground into some real damage in the air, especially the 3 toughness that are being relevant, meaning that this gets through other early game flyers quite well. The crew 1 is actually pretty good because it lets you turn a creature on the ground that may not be able to deal damage anymore based on the board state into damage in the air. So it kind of augments your creatures, allows them to deal damage in other ways. And the flying here is what pushes Sky Skiff into good playable territory. The other one is Renegade Freighter, and I do believe this is a very strong card for a common. A lot of people are skeptical about vehicles and the crew costs being maybe a little bit too high to play. I actually don't think that. I think crew 4 and crew 5 vehicles will come up more often than people are giving them credit for, and I think they will win games of limited often. But I don't think anyone's disagreeing that crew 2 is reasonable. So Renegade Freighter, for 3 mana, you get a vehicle with crew 2. When it attacks, it gets +1/+1 and trample until end of turn. Crew 2 is very doable. Not to mention there are pilots that work extremely well with this card while also being able to crew them by itself. And the 1/1 in trample means this attacks as a 5/4 trample or potentially started on turn 4. It's just going to get in there. Because of trample, your opponent's not going to want to block. Otherwise, they're losing a creature and still taking damage, which means this is often going to lava axe your opponent's face very, very quickly and very often if you can continue to crew it. It gives your opponent a reason to kill your smaller creatures so that you can stop crewing it, but it's not too hard to just play another creature and then crew it up and attack again. Honorable mention number 1 goes to Aradara Express. I look at this card and I think it's very powerful, and then I see other people look at it and say that it's virtually unplayable because of the crew 4. Yes, there are times that you're going to play this 5-mana artifact and you're not going to be able to crew it, but I think those times are going to be a lot less frequent than people give it credit for. At least as long as I've been playing Limited, there are very, very often board states where you have 4 powers worth of creatures floating around that you can't really use. They're not attacking. You don't have favorable attacks with them. You can't really block with them either, or people are just sitting around not doing anything. Aradara Express lets you translate your creatures that can't attack into an absolutely ridiculous beast of a creature. Like, 8/6 Menace is really strong, and yes, I think the risk is here that you may just play a 5-mana do-nothing, but I think it's going to be a lot more frequent that this gets in there and deals a lot of damage or forces some blocks that your opponent doesn't want to make than it is that this will just be sitting here and you won't be able to take advantage of it. It is a little unfortunate that there are bounce spells that deal with this so cheaply, meaning that if you tap down a lot of guys and then swing in with this, your opponent can really get you, but you just got to be smart about how you play it and not run into those sorts of effects. But 8 power on a menace creature is extremely strong, and I think this card is a little bit stronger than people are giving it credit for. The other common I'll mention is Snarethopter. I kind of missed this the first time through because I didn't realize it had haste, but for 4 mana you get a 3/2 with flying and haste. I already mentioned how 4 mana 3/2 flyers are great, so tacking haste onto it turns it into what I actually consider a strong card rather than just a good card. I would actively play this card in pretty much any deck, and the fact that it's colorless means that it ends up being a lot higher pick than you should expect. Uncommons, the first slot goes to Filigree Familiar, and I think this deserves a top slot, not necessarily because it's super powerful, but because you'll always play it every single time. I don't think I will ever cut this card from my deck just because it does so much for my 3-drop. It's Exultant Cultist on steroids. It gains you some life. It fits in every single deck. You don't have to play around it. You're happy trading it. Like, what else can you say about it? It's a small Solemn Simulacrum. Definitely not as strong. Plus, it's a fox, and, I mean, it's just cute. Look at it. The other card here is Chief of the Foundry. I really like this card in Origins, where it played nicely with Thopters. It's going to play a lot better in this format. Again, being colorless means it fits in every single deck. Same thing I said about every colorless card here. And the fact that there are Fabricate creatures that let you spread your damage out in the form of servos means I really want to prioritize Chief of the Foundry when I have those servo generators. When I have a lot of Fabricate creatures, this card is good. And if I already have this card, I start to prioritize Fabricate creatures. Not to mention my other artifacts just get a lot better. So the card is quite good. I think it's probably a high pick. Maybe not first pickable. I don't think it's that strong. But I think it's flexible enough in as far as what decks you play it in and how strong it'll be in those decks that I would pick it up quite early. I'm thinking around 3rd, 4th, 5th pick, something like that. Honorable mention number 1 goes to Ballista Charger, another vehicle on this list, but one that I think will actually play out very well a vast majority of the time. You'll notice Crew 3 is marginally less than Crew 4, but noticeably less that you should be able to crew quite often. This one costs 5 mana. It comes down as a 6/6 whenever you crew it for 3, and then when it attacks, it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Again, if you can kill a creature with this, this is fantastic. There are a lot of games where this will be used to just pick off tokens, which is nice. And the 6/6 means that it's very hard to block and get it off the board without having to multi-block and make very, very sad blocks as far as your opponent's side of the field goes. This also just maybe goes unblocked and deals 7 damage. So I think the power level is here on this one. It's obviously stronger than Aradara Express in most regards, but if you compare the cards side by side, they're not so different that you can say this card is really, really good and the Express is really, really bad. But I do think this card is noticeably better, maybe even better than Chief of the Foundry and Filigree Familiar, but probably doesn't fit in as many decks. And then Bombat Bazaar Barge, BBB. 4 mana, 5/5 vehicle. When it enters battlefield, draw a card and crew 3. So the fun part about this is that sometimes your vehicles come down and they don't do anything. You're not able to crew them, or you don't want to crew them, you don't want to attack. At least the Bazaar Barge draws you a card, meaning that if this thing never actually gets into the red zone, at least it replaced itself. And you can use it as a blocker if need be, if your attacks aren't going very well. So 5/5 for 4, being a good body on it, draws you a card, replaces itself, and a reasonable crew cost leads me to believe that this is quite a good card too, that you'll play in almost any deck. Alright, I am done stumbling over my words now. This is a very long video, but I think it's worth going through it, not just because I want to do good for pre-release and I want to evaluate the cards ahead of time, but I want to voice my opinion and share what I think about Limited here with other people who may not have a good sense of evaluation. Again, I could be completely wrong. Maybe all these cards suck and I need to really revamp how I'm evaluating limited sets. And again, I didn't talk about rares here, so there aren't a lot of slam dunk bombs that I talked about. But these are the cards that make up the majority of your sealed pool. They're the cards that you're actively trying to draft to make a top tier draft deck. So I'd love to share my opinion and see what people think about them. On that note, if you have any opinions about any of the cards I mentioned, or you think something else deserves to be in the top spot, or obviously if you think something does not deserve to be in one of the spots I put it in, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, I thank you guys for watching and taking the time out of your day to go through this video with me. I hope you guys do great at pre-release. I loved hearing pre-release stories last time it happened, and how people were surprised by certain cards or noticed that certain cards just performed very, very well. So let me know those stories when you play. Let me know what cards worked out well for you. My name is Timothy. I will see you all next time.